This is the second part of my discussion with Tom Schuneman, owner and editor of Global Warming is Real. In this episode, we focus on how the flawed assumptions of a broken system are preventing us from acting on the polycrisis. Efforts to address the crises are being undermined by fossil fuel industry disinformation that exploits these structural weaknesses. We also make some suggestions as to how we may best respond. Let's get into it.
Okay, so we've been talking about the polycrisis in the abstract, but I think it might be good to look at specific examples of how it manifests itself in the real world. Let's say Somalia, for instance. They have the threat of drought, armed conflict, food insecurity, children without care, violence, exploitation. I mean, that's one aspect of all the various forces of a polycrisis bearing down on one localized population. What are some others that you can think of that would exemplify the polycrisis in the real world?
There are lots of examples, and it is important to be able to draw the connection from the abstract concept. And you just mentioned a really good one. Let's go from the general to the more specific. So right now in our contemporary world in the West, we can see causal links between technological innovations and dramatic changes in our economics. These changes have radically transformed social norms and politics. And, in recent decades, the technology has reshaped the way we look at things. And it's the identity crisis that I referred to earlier. That's the net result. So people are experiencing an identity crisis, dispossession, which is leading to political change, to upheaval, or at least a desire for political change as people feel dislocated. And I also mentioned the pandemic, which is an important one. But one of the things that we need to appreciate is those that are hurt worst by the polycrisis, who have done commonly the least, to actually cause the crisis in the first place. And so there should be some collective guilt on the part of, the affluent West. We have inadvertently, of course, but we have contributed to, the conflict in Haiti, for example. I'm not going to go into a history lesson on Haiti, but it's very interesting for anyone who is interested. There is definitely a relationship between the colonial powers, France, and, their early exit from colonialism and the price that they had to pay, which created a whole bunch of problems that are manifest today. So the combination of political instability, gang violence, economic collapse, food and water scarcity. Right now, I think half the population is struggling to get enough food. There's complex relationships. You mentioned a very good one in Somalia, but in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel, it's a very similar dynamic where you have the combination of drought and a food crisis and inflation, right? Which is not just a problem of the Western world. And this impacts tens of millions, increasing radically starvation. And, we don't have the bandwidth at this point with all the crises to even begin to address these conflicts. So, we're in a situation where we continue to perpetuate more and more of these conflicts. The best examples that I can give, because the most dramatic, is probably the two wars that are currently taking place. So both Russia's war in Ukraine and Israel's war in Gaza, they have pervasive social, economic, and political impacts. And that's reverberating all around the world. As you know, Russia's war has driven up energy and food prices. That's what caused the inflationary spiral. And this has ignited a global cost of living crisis. So there's widespread social and political dissatisfaction as a corollary of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And if you look at the climate costs are incredible. The war generates 175, did you know that? 175 million tons of CO2 per year. That's like 90 million new cars or more than 250 coal-fired power plants. We're talking about massive amounts of greenhouse gases being generated. I guess the point is, Tom, it's the combination of climate impacts and conflict. It creates a vicious cycle, and that vicious cycle is at play throughout the polycrisis concept, however it manifests itself. So each crisis exacerbates the other. A good circular loop would be like climate change causes crop failure. The crop failure leads to food insecurity. This increases the risk of conflict over those scarce resources, which in turn leads to more displacement and environmental damage, more crop failure, more food insecurity, on and on and on,
Right.
And it's these vicious loops, these vicious cycles that are very hard to break free of, because we have a tendency, if we approach them at all, to approach them from a singular vantage point without understanding the complex, once again, interrelationships that are key to deciphering what's actually going on behind the surface. One of my favorite things to do is to look at this, not just from the point of view of how it works well, but sometimes people like myself and people like you, I'm sure, with the best of intentions, can have negative impacts. So, for example, well, here's a really good one. The reduction in shipping emissions. Everybody would say that that's a good thing that has benefited us. But as you probably know, that has allowed more of the sun's rays to penetrate through the ocean surface. And that's actually increased warming, ocean warming, even alleviating poverty and reducing mortality rates, right? Net good. How can that be bad? Well, as populations grow and people have more income, we see increases in demand for food, water, for energy, and this increases GHGs and depletes resources. So once again, we need to understand that even those pro-social laudable attempts to do good also have negative sequelae. We need to pay heed to these relationships and try to craft and engineer solutions that don't just say, forgive me for being facile, but feed people. We need to solve these issues longer term, and that will require far more creative thinking. But whatever solutions we propose with that as the framework within which we operate are more likely to increase positive results and minimize the negative results. They'll be more efficient.
Yeah, I think if we don't approach it understanding, well, if we did this, what could happen, or should do something quickly, is legitimate, but we need to act carefully and prudently, thoughtfully, and holistically. And I think there's just a lot of urge, a lot of motivation to throw crap at the fan and see what sticks. The guy who's the head of Facebook, Zuckerberg, is he the one that said move fast and break things or something like that? And look what's happened.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not familiar with Mr. Zuckerberg's comment, but certainly, I mean, it's patently absurd. And again, we have reams of research indicating that, we clearly, to be very generous and kind to humanity, we have made colossal mistakes. I don't think making mistakes is so much the problem. It's making those mistakes and then lying about the fact that we have made mistakes, and then actually creating complex, sophisticated disinformation campaigns to prevent us from acknowledging the realities, to embrace the science. We're trying to disparage science. In some quarters are trying to disparage science, disparage even reason, and embracing, whatever brand of conspiracy you choose to subscribe to. This is my reality and it's equally legitimate. So my made up reality is equivalent to your scientific evidence. And that's just absurd. I mean, there's no way that we can function or survive if we continue to maintain that point of view. But there's something, problematic, as you know, right? You cannot, the studies are clear and conclusive. The more you push back against these folks who have, shall we say, inherently wrong ideas, the more likely they are to more passionately embrace them. So you're not going to push them off. They're only going to cleave to them more closely. So my approach is a little bit different in the sense that I'm encouraging all folks, myself included, everyone, to actually review the ways by which we have been brainwashed, for want of a better word. The idea that we have effectively bought into a conception of reality, a way of framing our perceptions, a way of framing our experience that is inherently flawed, that is fundamentally broken. This will actually appeal to some. So even some on that, in those fringe groups who may, not have much love for science, might actually be interested in appreciating, the ways that they may be misperceiving reality, or that the man may be encouraging them to misperceive reality. Big government, call it what you will.
Right.
If we can get people to reflect upon how it is they come to subscribe to some views, just to reflect on that notion, why do I believe X? That, in my view, is winning the war. If we can just get someone to stop and not say, you should believe like me or you should embrace this fact, but simply to ask themselves the question so that they can begin to ponder the veracity of their own views. It can't happen from without, that is clear. But, I have some anecdotal personal experience that suggests if you posit ideas at the right time in the right place, some folks will begin to reflect, not because you're pushing them to do so, but because you're encouraging them to reflect on what they perceive to be real. And there's an audience for this type of discussion. And it is my hope that, even some on the fringe might begin to, some point, perhaps it will take, misery, suffering, an unfortunate series of events, but at some point in the future, they may be forced to reconsider the worldview. Guys like Trainer believe that we need to experience complete and total collapse before we are going to begin to pick ourselves up and, reconstitute some semblance of quote unquote civilization. And he may be right. And maybe it's at that point. But if we can posit these ideas, if we can embed these seeds deeply in human consciousness, not so that anybody follows a particular ism, but so that people begin to conceive of the importance of, having a worldview that has some bearing on reality, that's connected to real world events, that actually is, real, as opposed to, a fictitious conspiracy theory that gives them a sense perhaps of belonging and connection, but is ultimately dysfunctional, that estranges them not only from others, but from the prospects of engaging a survivable future. I mean, this is a form of madness. And I think on a certain level, there's a common sense appeal that can be made. Again, not to encourage people to think in a certain way, but to just encourage people to think.
To think, exactly. To consider how it is we got to where we are. In your comments there, one thing popped in my head as far as a narrative being told that it does not reflect reality or manipulates people. I kind of alluded to it before in my mention of recycling, for instance. It was, I think, back in the 70s or so when the big oil companies promoted the idea of recycling to put the onus on the consumer. Mm-hmm. The head of Exxon just recently said, in effect, that, well, it's your fault to the general unwashed masses. You're the ones that aren't recycling, for instance. You're the ones that are putting gas in the car. So we're just giving you the oil we're just giving you the gas. It's not our fault. And so where we think, well, I have to recycle. This is the reality that, the reality is if I don't recycle, the planet's going to fall apart. Well, let's rethink that. Let's go back. I mean, not that recycling is inherently bad. It's not a discussion about recycling. It's just an example that we have a lot of assumptions, even that we think there are good assumptions. We think that it's good to recycle and that we're making a big difference. And the reality might not be quite what we think it is. And why do we think that way? What got us to think that this is the thing that we ought to do? Maybe there's another way to think about it. I mean, I'll recycle, but I also know that we're being told a story here, and that's the other danger of humans being a storytelling species, is we can tell ourselves some pretty crappy stories.
Yep, we can, and we do. I mean, you make a great point, and I don't need to go into the history of what the fossil fuel industry has done to protect its interests, everything from lying about the science that it did first and had access to before anybody else, to, undermining credible scientists who are just doing what they do, which is studying these phenomena, and they are disparaged, maligned, doxxed. I mean, there are a whole bunch of terrible things happen to these well-intentioned folks. It's a shame, and the point you made about shifting the responsibility, this is yet another way in which the fossil fuel industry and others have tried to shift the focus, right? Hansen called it the newest form of climate denial. So they went through stages, right? First they denied it, and now they're trying to shift the blame. The latest one, as you probably know, is it's too late anyways, which is just bizarre that they can actually come out and say that, because they're, as you know, increasing after the fiasco of the most recent COP. They're planning to increase production. So, COP28, the irony is that we were fed another bunch of lies, this whole carbon capture, carbon dioxide removal ruse. Not that these aren't bad, these are great technologies, but this is a ruse designed to give them a pretext to ramp up production and cash in, make more oil profit.
Right.
We are being fed these lies. That's a relatively superficial lie, but it's a very serious and damning lie that tells you where they're at. There are also deeper lies. There are also lies that are more fundamental to the way that our consciousness is structured. And so the idea of growth, which we've referenced at several points throughout this conversation, is something that I delve very deeply into. The growth mindset is pernicious. And I'm going to use myself as an example. It's amazing the extent to which, even though I was making myself aware of the extent to which I'm influenced by this concept of growth that has smuggled itself into my consciousness, I cannot so easily divest myself of it. And so in my personal and my professional life, I find it still haunts me. So I'm well aware of how deeply ingrained it is and how pernicious it is and how ambitious it is for us to begin to look at these issues. But there is also a cascade effect here as well. So the extent to which we begin to ask the simple question, not to say that we're going to get any grand solutions, but just ask the question, where did I get this idea of growth from? We begin to unravel. And this unraveling gives us the space to envision something better, gives us the opportunity to imagine a better world unmolested by these destructive ideas that have ultimately created what could become a cataclysmic hell. That's not hyperbole. We are facing not just an uncertain future, we are facing a situation unprecedented in human history. So much as Hitler was a bad man, and much as a world run by fascism would be awful, what we are talking about here with the Polycrisis is, the end of civilization as we know it, and the amount of starvation and suffering, the amount of brutality and violence that comes along with starvation and suffering and scarcity of resources. Again, to call this an apocalyptic hell is not overstating the point. So we have more than ample justification and reason to do everything we can. And it's not just about recycling. And I think, like you, I try to do these little things, but we need to think big. We need to have more ambition. We need to strive to do more than just that little tiny drop. We need to take on the complex issues. And even if we don't understand the nuances, just the simple act of appreciating this is one integrated crisis that we will not survive, that we must act to address. This in and of itself lends itself well to voting decisions, for example, that can make all the difference, and I don't need to tell you how important it is to make the right voting decisions, because your leaders will ultimately determine whether or not your nation has a climate policy or protects biodiversity or has social programs, et cetera, or takes them all away, and I don't need to tell you that the agenda of certainly Project 2025 and other similar conservative projects is to radically cut back, if not eliminate altogether, social programs, certainly an end to any sort of environmental regulation. We want to take away regulations, not add more regulations that will make people safer, that will make our environment cleaner. We need to take away anything that could restrict business from maximizing its ability to reap profits. Well, that's a recipe for collective death. Again, this is not hyperbole.
Certainly. Yeah. If the folks behind Project 2025 have their way, they'll completely eliminate the Environmental Protection Agency. Take growth, for instance. If you even broach the idea that maybe worshiping at the altar of growth is something that can at least think about, maybe there's another way, maybe growth is bad. Just saying that in some circles, in many circles, you'd be outcast. You'd be thrown to the wolves. I think the first step for any of this is for us to be able to talk about it, to talk about these things that seem so anathema, like maybe growth, maybe there's another way, to structure an economy. And then you're automatically, well, what are you, some sort of a commune? It just falls into these, everybody runs to their corners, and instead of, well, no, let's let's just talk about it. I'm not saying that let's just talk about it. And we're at a point now where we can't even talk about it, it seems like.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what your life is like, Tom, but I'm sure, like me, folks who end up on the right side or conservative side of the political spectrum, and, many attempts, kicks at the can, shall we say, to try to communicate on these issues. And I have, and perhaps you've been more successful than me, but I've been wildly unsuccessful, shut down, sometimes, unpleasantly, shall we say. But at the end of the day, what I have found works better. So I've sort of reality tested these ideas with folks that I know. I hope they don't listen to this and then they'll find out that they've been reality tested. But anyways, what I am doing is I'm asking the question, so let's say with growth, but you can do it with other things. How did you come to this idea that growth is great? What makes you think, that growth is so great? And not even stick around to answer the question, because I find that you become a foil, or at least I have become a foil where they'll react against the snowflake. Whereas what you perhaps want to do is just, again, encourage that process of thought, planting seeds. I think it's fair to say that most of those seeds will not germinate, but occasionally, and again, I've witnessed this in my own life, occasionally you'll have folks who are inclined to want to think. Sometimes, it's a crisis in their own personal life that, makes them reflect a little bit more. And sometimes it's just a natural internal process. But certainly what I know doesn't work is, being didactic, is trying to give people the facts.
Yeah.
It's so counterproductive, and as a younger man, I think I believed naively that, well, when you share the facts with folks, they will embrace the facts. I'm now quite clear in my mind that there are some folks who simply want to disregard the facts. It's a willful act. It's not like a mistake. It is a deliberate, willful choice that they make. I choose to adopt these series of beliefs because they make me feel better than your series of facts.
Yeah, it's willful ignorance. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why asking the question is always safer. And this is a conversation that I hope to have. Again, I'm not in any way hiding an agenda. I simply would like to give my children an opportunity to survive. That's it.
Yeah.
And every child everywhere. I would like to, see this world prosper, as Pollyanna as that might seem. That is my intent and my goal. I don't have, an anti-Republican or anti-conservative agenda. I have an agenda that is about protecting biodiversity, protecting human beings, protecting our relationships to each other, which are fundamental and important. And yeah, I'm prepared to prioritize that over the economy. I'm prepared to prioritize that, or would like to encourage the prioritization of that over, anything else. Money, it serves us no use, right? What is the quote? There is no economy on a dead planet, right?
Yes, true.
So we can have all the money in the world, but what does it ultimately amount to if the world around us is dying? Again, sounds like it's hyperbolic, but it's not. There's objective evidence to demonstrate the impact that humans have had on this planet, and we are effectively killing the world upon which our economy depends. The savage irony of this is just, it's bizarre. And I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with folks who are looking to protect their profit margin and prepared to forego the realization that their activities are contributing to the demise of civilization collectively. It's fascinating, right? I mean, it's truly interesting. So I in part want to deconstruct all of these issues, understand the whys. It's not as insane, although it is somewhat insane, but it's not as insane as it appears. There's an internal logic. There are reasons why we find ourselves where we are. You've mentioned fossil fuels. Certainly our energy dependence is critical, but I don't need to point out to you, Tom, that this energy dependence, our ability to exploit fossil fuels, has contributed to the growth of civilization, to the industrial revolution, to increasing standard of living all around the world. But the concomitant effect, right, is disastrous.
Yeah. Anybody that probably be listening to this has benefited greatly from fossil fuels. No argument from me there. That's not the point. The point is that we can't continue this way. I learned writing about or being an advocate in climate change, if you're cognizant at all of your impact, you learn early on that convincing anybody from the facts by showing them the chart of the ice melting and the CO2 rising and all the facts, while they're important, and I do think they need to be reported, you're not going to change anybody's mind with that unless their mind wants to be changed. And people, they're so entrenched in their belief that they're not looking to have their mind changed. So
correct. Yeah.
Following some fact over there is not going to make any difference.
So right. And that's why I think, approaching this from the perspective that sort of taps into an undercurrent of subculture thought, this conspiratorially minded mindset. I mean, I've actually done some data analytics on the topic, and the extent to which folks are more and more naturally gravitating towards these conspiracies. Now, again, as I said earlier, a lot of these conspiracies are just wild, outlandish, divorced from any semblance of reality. But that which I am referring to in the Polycrisis project is really all about understanding the extent to which our reality has been shaped and how we conform. It's an unwitting conformity. It's an unconscious conformity. But I think there's some interest there. So without mentioning climate change, without mentioning biodiversity loss, without mentioning that fossil fuels may be highly destructive to our way of life, we can talk about the ways in which big business, government forces us to think in a certain way. And then we might even want to go deeper. How is it that governments come to these conclusions? Why is it that big business comes to these conclusions? I say in later chapters of what I'm working on that you can't really blame the oil industry for doing what the market sets out for them to do. They're simply following market dictates, which is maximizing profits. These are the rules of the game. And then you're going to criticize them or saying, but you're manipulating the rules so you can maximize your profits. But this indeed is what every great industrialist has done since the dawn of time. This is the playbook. Sure. This is the format. So the idea that we can villainize fossil fuels, and I do, but the idea that we can villainize fossil fuels divorced from context, I think is somewhat naive. It is far more complex and subtle. It is a pervasive way in which we have been influenced. Our minds have been shaped. Literally, neural architectures are formed. The way that our brains are structured is a function of the environment in which we grow. So we, in effect, have been brainwashed to subscribe to a series of beliefs that are ultimately a form of suicide. We, of course, are unaware that we are committing suicide, but can you not see the clear connection between a recognition of the ominous threats that we face, civilization-ending threats, and our failure to act? If that's not suicide, I don't know what is.
I agree. It's the context. I vilify fossil fuel industry as well, but you also have to back off and look at the context of how they got there. Now, you can certainly argue that they knew, at least in the 70s, I think even back into the 50s,
60s.
Yeah. They knew, and they took a concerted effort to manipulate the public about that. So there's that. When you become the most powerful corporation in the world, when you get that sort of influence and power, it's very difficult to give it up.
And you have incentive to rig the game.
Yeah.
So whether it's through ALEC or whether it's through Citizens United, or you manipulate the judiciary, you manipulate the legislature, you throw your weight, your power, your financial might into these, races, you determine political outcomes. All of these things are within their purview. So they would say to themselves, well, why wouldn't I want to tell children, as they do in textbooks that they provide kindly for free to children in public schools, telling that fossil fuels is good. It's helping you in many ways. And it's not entirely a lie. It at one point clearly was something that helped us to, progress, if you want to use that word. But again, as you said earlier, it is quite clear that we are now at a junction in history where we recognize there is no path forward, none, that include the use of fossil fuels. And that includes carbon capture or carbon dioxide removal, all of these technologies, which again are great, but there's no way that they can make up for the amount of GHGs that are being spewed into the atmosphere by the ongoing increase year after year of our exploitation and burning of fossil fuels.
Yeah. We're experiencing now, in terms of climate change, is from the carbon that was sent up a decade ago. The whole economic argument, it's as if we are at the service of the economy instead of the economy being at the service of humanity. And it's backwards. It's backwards.
I mean, it's a great point. I mean, you've probably seen this, but the nested model versus the Brundtland report model, the three intersecting Venn diagram, which is so common. The reality is that, the economy should not be the overriding factor. The economy is within, so the social, the environmental, this is the overriding concern and issue. Again, we depend upon the economy, we depend upon the environment for our sustenance. Take the environment out of the equation and there is no economy. So it's an insane way to order, hierarchically, or even to give them equal weight. There is no question that without our environment, there is no economy. And without the social dynamics that are so crucial to our well-being, there is also no prospect, no future. We need these things to work. We need them to work together, but we need to understand, we need to prioritize what is important. And right now, as you have pointed out, the economy takes precedence over everything. And that's just, once again, a function of a broken mindset, a series of broken assumptions that we have inculcated from classical economics that we don't challenge. And it's fascinating the extent to which we can live with these things and not even begin to consider, well, why should I even begin to question the validity, the veracity, the utility of these things? I'm so used to them. They are part of me. They are just accepted. And of course, that's what an assumption is. So this idea of challenging broken assumptions is absolutely fundamental to this effort. Again, I'm not talking about positing solutions at this point, but simply by encouraging folks to ask the question, why is the assumptions that you rely on, why is that the be all and end all? And if it is, that's fine. So if at the end of your investigation, you find out that all of your assumptions make perfect sense, great. Then, but perhaps you'll find like the rest of us.
Good for you.
Let us know how you did that one.
Yeah.
Because the math is clear. This is the complexity is there, but the big picture issue here is pretty straightforward. We're on the highway to hell with our foot on the accelerator. And
yes, indeed.
It's not a realistic approach to living our lives, and certainly does not afford future generations their right to a livable future. So even if you're not doing it for yourself, a couple of people I know who are older say, well, it's not going to be in my lifetime. Maybe not. But at the end of the day, we do kind of owe to future generations, particularly those of us who have benefited from this fossil fuel powered economy. We owe it to future generations to do what we can to address the problem that we created, that we benefited from. So, I mean, that's my take on it. And again, even if it's tilting at windmills, Tom, as I've told you before, I don't really see myself as having a choice. We got to try, we got to try.
Yeah, I agree. Sometimes I feel like I'm doing just that, tilting at windmills, but I totally agree that we are the beneficiaries of a system that is broken at this point, and we owe it to the future to do something about it. And that starts, as you say, we can't posit solutions necessarily, but what we can do is start to examine our assumptions, how we got here, why we think the way we think. And I think that if we think about it, that's a start. We can go from there.
I think it begins to unravel. So what I've witnessed in watching people go through this, or trying to get some insight into how views are changed in the rare instances where it occurs, there's sort of an unraveling that takes place where, people begin to question maybe something in the end, and one of the beads sort of falls off. And the next thing you know, a whole bunch of other beads start to follow. But the key I have found, the linchpin to make this work, is to not, again, bring it from the outside in, but to encourage folks to take it upon themselves to address this on their own, to just ask the question internally. And they might, mull it over for days, weeks, months, years, but at some point it might dawn in them that, wait, something is not right. And I think, even amongst my conservative friends, this is ubiquitous. Everybody that I know, conservative, liberal, or in between, they're all feeling something is not quite right. And that's what we need to tap into. That's a universal almost sentiment, where we're all feeling like something, the Republican talking point, as you know, is, crime in the streets. And now there might not be actual crime, but the malaise that they're referencing, that's very real.
That's
and
real.
So we can tap into that malaise, and we can give people points of reflection. Once again, trying not to be didactic, but giving them the opportunity to consider, well, how did we find ourselves in this state of affairs? We don't even need to get into the weeds about right versus left. These are very human issues. And as I discussed later, there are common bonding elements, one of which you brought up earlier in this conversation. Just, if nothing else, most folks care about their kids. Most folks don't want to see children suffer, even if they're not your kids. So even if you are a bit cold-hearted, most folks are still going to say, I don't really feel comfortable with the idea of causing immense suffering to future generations. And that's a starting point to reflect. That's a starting point to reflect. And maybe they can see ways in which, they can address the situation. But again, it starts by addressing the broken assumptions that prevent us from seeing the problem clearly.
We're all human, so there are certain basic human elements that we can all agree on. We want our children to thrive. I don't think there's anybody that would say trash the environment or something like that. So
the coal rollers might, but I know what you mean.
Well, yeah. Hopefully, your work and the conversations like this can help seed these sorts of thought processes in people, because it does have, if you put a seed in somebody's brain to it's okay to think about it, that's, like you say, that can get the ball rolling, and hopefully that'll start happening.
One can only hope. I mean, the alternative, of course, is the failure to appreciate all of this interconnectedness. And then we are going to continue into this spiral of self-reinforcing downward spiral to which there is not a positive resolution. So if we really do want to stop human suffering, if we want to, end the destruction, we need to break these vicious cycles. And to do that, we need coordinated, multifaceted interventions that factor these interrelationships. And this is a start to have people think about that. So by appreciating the complexity, all the different ways that these crises interact, we are going to be able to better understand and address the problems. And that means we can maximize the impacts of our actions while minimizing the unwanted side effects. But it all starts by asking the question. It all starts by questioning those assumptions that clearly, regardless of your ideological orientation, have not served us well.